everyone. And thank you for the kind introduction, and not at least for being invited here to this very important conference. And I have to declare that I'm not a scientist in this field, but I have been treating and handling prostate cancer for about 30 years. So I know about overdiagnosis. Let's see if this works. I have some disclosures, as clinicians have. We heard Wednesday, but it's not about overdiagnosis. When I chose my specialty, I thought that prostate, that must be an easy one. It isn't, and it has never been. So this is a mandatory father and son conversation that men have 4 problems: women, money, booze, and prostate. Prostate is a small gland. It's part of the male reproductive system, and it is located just beneath the bladder. See if I can point here. And unfortunately, this gland surrounds the urethra and makes a lot of fuss for grown-up men. We have this kind of tumors very often stays inside the prostate, but it can spread, and most of them will never need treatment, but you can still, patients are still dying. Some are dying from this disease. We have already heard a lot about PSA and prostate, and I got a lot on my chest or heart, so please fasten your seatbelts. We're going to have this flight together. I focus on some challenges, and one of them is very obvious. It's the occurrence or the incidence of this disease. This is Danish numbers. We had the first registration of all cancers back 1908. There were a prevalence of 3 Danes having prostate cancer, and it rose during last century, and suddenly it exploded. We have an epidemic which has been seen in most Western countries. And I state that prostate cancer is a natural health condition in elderly men. The probability of harboring such a cancer at 60-year-old is flip the coin. So look around. And it increases from there with age, so I can't even personally use a coin anymore to see my risk. And in fact, the median age is 72 to have this diagnosis. So it is elderly man, preferable. And that's a challenge where we have an aging population. This is birth rate from the Second World War with these baby booms in US. We have the same numbers in Denmark. So there's a generation coming to us, and there will be much fewer of us to take care of us, the baby boomers. So here we come with prostate cancer, the silver tsunami, and there's a huge job for our health systems. And that's my hospital in Aarhus. Then, what about treatment and quality of life? When I got a doctor nearly 35 years ago, there was no cure for prostate cancer, castration. Most of them had the diagnosis during surgical procedure for benign obstruction. And they were often not told that they had cancer. They will come back to us if they need our help. So at that time, the rates of mortality and incidence were linked together. There was not really any overdiagnosis. Having the diagnosis, you will die from the disease. Then we had, in the 90s and the zeros, we got effective curable treatments, surgical, as well as radiation. And that was good for some of the patients, but there's always a dark side of the moon. Most of them lost their erectile function, of those we do make surgery on, and many get urinary incontinence. And we had a patient-reported outcome measurement in 15,000 of our patients, and those who had surgery and radiation, I just closed it. Here, they had a dramatic drop in sexual function and continence, as you see, and a drop in quality of life. So there is this dark side of the moon. What about timely diagnosis? There are still men dying from this disease. Symptoms, PSA testing, and overdiagnosis. Well, another challenge in prostate cancer is that it is a snake. You will not have any symptoms as long as the disease is curable and localized. When you get symptoms, it's too late. You're bitten by this Australian snake. But luckily, we have this blood test, the PSA. And in the European Urological Society, they tell us that testing the prostate is as easy as testing oil on your car. So, should we test or not? I guess this is a little spooky, and that's why Marty is on the picture as well. Because PSA is not a marker of cancer. Normally, I say it's a physiological enzyme, and I normally call it a laundry booster to ensure that the seminal fluid is liquid so that men can make babies. And there's a lot of reasons why you can measure this enzyme in the blood: benign enlargement, cystitis, prostate cancer, and if you are biking in Tour de France, massage. And the definition of what is elevated or normal in PSA is also just a line drawn in the sand over or below 4 nanogram per ml. But if we look up this is the area, this is the upper limit, so this is elevated, and this is in the number, in the concentration we want to pick up our patients for surgery. But what do we find in this area? We find cancer, we find BP8, and we find nothing. Exactly what we find in normal PSAs. But it has been used for screening, and this is a figure I made from a huge European randomized study for screening with PSA. And to save this man, inside 10 years, you have to screen 1,410 patients. And to save him, he's still here, you have to treat 48 patients. Still, don't forget the dark side of the moon. 16 years after, in this study, there is a difference. We can see that this is the screened one, and this is the controls. But look at the y-axis. There's hardly any numbers here. And in fact, in absolute numbers, it's less than 300 men that benefited from this screening in more than 160,000 participants. And if we look at who benefits, we can see here that the yellow line is below. You got benefit from screening. Here you don't. And this is the age. And when it's crossed 62, there's no benefit on mortality at all. And most of the men who screen is more than 62 and 80 perhaps. And already when I looked back, when I made my thesis in the 90s, we had this article, Look to Denmark when we're talking prostate cancer. Because in Sweden, they have always been more eager to diagnose this disease. And at that time, the incidence was more than doubled as in Denmark. But the mortality was totally the same. So what happened? Because suddenly, there was no link between incidence and mortality anymore. And General Schwarzkopf, he beat it up Saddam Hussein, and then he had cancer, and then he would beat that too. And he said that there is this simple blood test that everybody should know about. And they did. And we have treated thousands of men, but look at the mortality. Nothing really happens. And that's because the natural history of this disease tells us that a 50-year-old man's chance of developing prostate cancer, about 40%, dying from it is less than 3. And this mismatch is a core driver of the overdiagnosis. So the good one, like Clint Eastwood, do not need any diagnosis. The bad one does. He needs treatment. And the ugly one we can't even cure. So the measures in this, the PSA measures is not matching the allowable catch quota when we go fishing for prostate cancer men. And poor Richard Albin, the American pathologist who discovered PSA in the 70s, he had to say in New York Times at the 40th anniversary day for his development, or for his discovery, that it's such a profit-driven health disaster. Stop the inappropriate use of PSA and the unnecessary treatments. He looks a little sad, I think. What about data? Well, in Denmark, like we will hear in Norway, we have incredible, unique personal data because we all have an identification number, and we are followed from cradle to grave. We can do nothing without it's registered. And of course, we use that in our database of prostate cancer. And what we did observe during COVID was that this is before COVID, the incidence of prostate cancer, and this was in 2020. And in the springtime, early spring, in March, April, the incidence dropped dramatically because the GPs closed the doors for not acute treatments. What happened? Well, that year we lost 300 men in our collection. Or we spared 300 men for a diagnosis, but they came never back. They just fell out. So that suggests a frequent daily overdiagnosis. And John Alexandra's You Must Read book, soon coming in English, shows this graph of how different GPs use PSA test in here 19 different clinics in the same local area. It ranged from 0 tests to nearly 300. So there's a huge difference how we handle this. We did the same experience in our own region, looking into 368 clinics, more than 300,000 men, and more than nearly 4,200 incident cancers. The same difference in testing, but the mortality was totally the same. So PSA testing, it increased diagnostic and surgical procedures, and the potential harmful side effects of these treatments, but it does not change mortality. So why do men have their PSA tested then? Well, because they go to their GPs because they have urinary problems or bothers. And that is quite normal in elderly men, as I told you. That is the number of benign, this BPH, and that's age, and that's the prevalence, and the number is just about the same in percentage and in prevalence of age. And the cancer is just this line following it. So when a man goes to his doctor because of a weak stream or nightly urinary, he comes home with a cancer diagnosis. He should probably never have known about. Is there no link between it, the cancer and the BPH? No, not really. It's almost always in the peripheral zone of prostate, and it does not make any obstruction of the urethra. This is benign obstruction. That doesn't play any role here. John Brodersen and colleagues have shown that as well in Danish data. They are not at risk of prostate cancer because of this bother. Then finally, how to reduce this PSA testing? Well, I have to mention John one more time. He and I and colleagues were sitting together with the National Board of Health, making this entrance text to our fast-track cancer packages in prostate cancer, and stated that we have no room for opportunistic or systematic screening. Lots urinary bothering should not lead to PSA testing. And the next day, we had this in the press from our patients' organization saying, wow, this is a disaster they're doing, the clinicians. But the GPs were, in fact, happy about it, no longer any overdiagnosis, and they should not do defensive medicine anymore. And it was an annoying follow-up in the press, in fact, and it was non-productive at all. I said at the time that I wonder why the Patients Association undermined their own cancer experts, but they came the next day in the same newspaper and said, we are not undermining science, we want to save lives. And it became very personally, I was really the bad guy in the press. I gathered my friends, and we stood shoulder by shoulder and said, come on guys, it doesn't hold water what you're saying. But again, referring to John, the perception gap, They answered back, thank you, professors. We see the balance between advantages and disadvantages differently. We don't speak the same language. And even their chairperson went to a big newspaper saying that I had no symptoms, I had cancer, get rid of it. I chose life over private parts, sexuality. So this emotional press is very hard to stand up to, and it's a very, very tough battle to win. It started back before. I had no gray hair then, it came because of, but already 15 years ago we had to say, come on guys, we'll not have this overdiagnosis. But we are pressed about an increased public awareness. There's even a Hall of Fame online of those who have died or have had cancer in the prostate. And we are right now on a political, not evidence-based pressure from EA and from for urological societies that have made this paper, PSA screening, with the conclusion, urgent actions required. Inspired by UK, a colleague and I made this pixie book for GPs years ago, and they had this block with cheer-off pages. Take this Con and Pro with you home, have a cup of coffee with your wife, come back tomorrow if you still want to have a PSA test. And there's a link for animation as well. And right now there's an ongoing PhD study in Denmark with half of the GPs, there's incredible many, to see if information and dialogue can change PSA testing in this practice. And I have in that study a 5 minutes pep talk about prostate cancer and why not PSAs, and ending up stating that I do not personally know my PSA level, although I have been doing this disease in 30 years. So what do we do meanwhile? Well, we try not to make over-treatment of those who have been overdiagnosed. And this is, we have an indicator saying that if you're a Clint Eastwood, the good one, you should not have treatment, you should be observed, you should have surveillance. And we can see that during the last 5 years, we are just about getting to our development goal that less than 5% of these patients will have treatment. And of course, in the future, we want to pick out the right person at the right time for the right treatment and spare all the men and their wives and loved ones for all this over-treatment. So until then, proactive prostate cancer detection, CDs, consider very carefully the consequences of your action. Thank you.